Welcome everyone to Life Science Cafe. My name is Natasha de la Rosa. I'm a PhD student in the Neuroscience and Behavior program at UMass Amherst, and I will be emceeing today. Established in 2011, Life Science Cafe is organized by graduate students, researchers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Each month, we invite different experts to discuss their research. Typically, we host these events in the Amherst communities, but we are happy to continue our efforts in virtually during this interesting time. We would like to thank you, our funders, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Program, the Graduate Student Senate, and the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our generous UMass giver donors. For our next event, we will be discussing the evolution of corals and their microbial friends with Dr. Raul Gonzalez Pech on May 20th. Subscribe to our mailing list and stay tuned for our Futures Cafe. And let me just show you that, oops, really quickly. There we go. And thank you all again for coming today. And welcome, Dr. Capello. You are free to share your slides right at this moment.
Okay, thank you all for having me. As Natasha was saying, my name is Dr. Capello. You can also call me Elias because it's a brand new title for me, and so I'm still adjusting to that life and that title. I go by they, them pronouns, and I'm going to pull up my slides and just get into it for everybody. Let's see here. Okay, so as I was saying, hi, my name is Elias Capello. I earned my PhD in anthropology just earlier this year. I was a February graduate from UMass Amherst. I use they, them pronouns. You're kind of catching me at a time in my life where, you know, I'm still learning and growing as an activist and a scholar. I bring in about 10 to 12-ish years of activist knowledge. And then on top of that, you know, obviously my PhD. I'm a professor currently at Savannah College of Art and Design. And I teach anthropology there to many different artists and design specialists and different folks that go on to different careers. I'm an organizer with a group called Southern Fried Queer Pride. They're a group that I worked with throughout my PhD and part of my master's program. And then I'm also a published artist and poet myself. So with this, I want to sort of acknowledge sometimes how a deep double-edged sword visibility can be. So I am choosing to be visible in my field, but that's also something that has come at sort of a great risk. Even when people have subconscious biases that they might not even realize. But one of my favorite quotes by Laverne Cox is that there's a power in naming yourself, proclaiming to the world, this is who you are. This is part of what inspired me to go into my PhD research. And I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But for now, I want to sort of start with some general terms that I come across in my own research and my fieldwork. Yeah, so the first term, and I think sometimes this can feel abrasive if we're not used to labeling ourselves. But in anthropology and linguistics, what is often the case is when a powerful normative group doesn't name themselves, it can sort of mask some of the violences and some of the biases that happen in our everyday life. So a term that, you know, I hope you kind of take forward today is cisgender. And what is cisgender? It means anyone who is not identifying outside of the gendered norms that they're given or assigned at birth. This means that trans itself, outside of that, can be quite expansive. What was really interesting throughout my master's and my PhD was I would go in the fields and talk to these incredible people who were doing great, like public health research, or there were nonprofit organizers, and they identified as trans, but they never felt quite trans enough. And if there is one thing that I want people to get from my definition of trans is as long as you identify as trans, you are trans. And within that umbrella, there are many different terms within that. And that's what I love as an anthropologist is that diversity. I listed quite a few in English, but there's also words for gender variant people in all sorts of other languages and cultures as well. And these are just a few that I come across in the field that I see people using to describe themselves. So the most important thing here, I think, is to think of trans as this umbrella in which outside of this view of cis male or cis female, there's actually a lot of diversity there and a lot of different experiences. Um, Within that, to sort of give a quote from my own dissertation, um, when I was out in the field interviewing people in Atlanta and different trans and non-binary organizers, I would ask them, what does it mean to be non-binary? Like, what does that label mean to you? And one of my favorite quotes came from a 28-year-old who was talking about how non-binary can feel like one day you're on one planet and another day you're on a completely different planet. It's about limitless possibilities and limitless definitions.
I really
Um,
love that. I really
yeah,
like how they described that. I thought that was fabulous.
yeah, it's my favorite one. um,
Oh yeah, but let's
so,
continue
okay.
on your differences between trans and non-binary and like explaining to us what those mean. Thank you.
Yeah. So with non-binary, and this is part of to get into because I kind of hear a question of there of like, what's the difference between trans and non-binary? Often in the field, what I find is that trans is the overarching umbrella of which non-binary can fall under. At the same time, trans it comes from the root of the word, comes from some pathologizing words that we used in the history of English in the United States. So transsexual or transvestite, which would have been words that the DSM, the American Psychological Association, would have used until the 1970s to diagnose trans people. And then we sort of,
Yeah, I've
yeah,
heard this only until like that was only like the last version. We're still only one version above that, and there's still so many changes to be made to the current one.
yeah. So gender identity disorder would have been the most recent one. And that's when, we saw that language shift. So part of what I see in the field and what I sort of hypothesize is that especially younger people are using non-binary instead of trans, because trans sort of still signals that it's sort of, I notice more older folks might use trans and then more younger folks might use non-binary. We can also get into that more later because I find that distinction really fascinating. But with this, with non-binary, anyone can be non-binary. I think sometimes we sort of see as more and more visibility is happening in American film and American media, we see very skinny, white, assigned female at birth people who are non-binary. And that's really important, but it's also much more expansive than that. Masculine people can be non-binary, feminine people. It doesn't matter your assigned sex at birth. You can be gender fluid. Um, there's no right way of signaling you're non-binary. There's no such thing as not being non-binary enough or being too non-binary. Um, so anyone can be non-binary. At the same time, in queer theory and queer ethnography, it's not the case that just anything goes. Gender still does matter. I see sometimes, particularly when I'm teaching college students, they'll fall into this trap of like, oh, then gender doesn't matter if it's just identity. At the same time, we still use culturally significant ways to express our gender, And that expression can be quite material for people, both in terms of empowerment, but also in terms of discrimination. If you are someone who is out and presenting in a way that does signal you as androgynous, that's very real, that you would experience certain types of discrimination, whereas not being out, you might not experience that same level. So at the same time, gender does matter in that regard.
So
Um,
how would you describe, so is there really a difference between gender and biological sex at that?
yeah, let me, I'll go to my
Oh.
slide on it. So with that, I think, hmm, so with the differences between it, I think often we kind of have a narrow view of sex. And one of the things that I kind of push back in my own academic journey is this idea that sex stays the same throughout our lives, and that our gender stays the same throughout our lives. So one of the things that I was going to encourage the audience to reflect on is, how did they express their gender when they were young versus how do they express their gender when they're older? Even if you're cis, I'm going to guess that's a little bit different. That you're not necessarily going to wear the same attire that you wore as a kid that you do as an adult. And that's because your gender expression has changed at least a little bit over time. It hasn't changed across a perceived binary. And so you might not have the same experiences as a trans person, but your gender has shifted. So a lot of the differences between biological sex is, one, that's going to be something that someone assigns to you at birth, typically by a physician based on visible genitalia. This can lead to some interesting politics around intersex rights activists who will push against sort of performing surgery on babies and infants to make them fit into this binary sex perception that we have. Rather than thinking of biological sex itself on a spectrum, a lot of times people will go in with male or female and then try to make infants sort of fit that if they don't show up that way in their own biology. But it also develops over time in that you can be assigned a sex at birth, and then it's very typical for a lot of intersex people that because of their genetics, they're going to develop a different hormone level. Their hormones aren't going to kick in at the quote unquote right time. And there's a huge human variation in our biology that's really important, I would argue, to the diversity that we have. And then you have your secondary sex characteristics. What's interesting about the idea that someone is quote unquote biologically female or not is that we wouldn't go, at least in American culture, we wouldn't go to a woman experiencing menopause and tell her because her hormones are shifting, she's less of a woman, nor would she necessarily feel less of a woman. And that's because our gender is a complex notion influenced by our culture and how we feel about our bodies. So for some people, that's exactly opposite from their biological sex. For some people, it's a mix. And I encourage everybody to sort of find that for themselves, find their own gender expression for themselves. Um, with this, we often have funny things that come up in my own life. My partner and I are trying to get pregnant. And it was time for her to get rid of some of the systems that we had for birth control. And they had to do a pregnancy test. And we were like, we don't need a pregnancy test. We laughed. We don't need a pregnancy test. And my partner was just like trying to tell the nurse that we didn't need a pregnancy test. She was like, no, you need a pregnancy test. And in my mind, I was like, okay, we're in the state of Georgia. Maybe there is some rule that like she needs a pregnancy
Yeah,
test. I don't know.
definitely.
Um, and we just kind of kept politely trying to say that the parts weren't there, but she didn't get it because she was looking at me and I was dressed kind of masculine, and she just didn't get it. because for her, I read as a guy, and we just like we couldn't think of a polite way to just say like we don't have the capability to do that because she was assuming my biological sex matched my gender presentation, and it doesn't. For the most part, it doesn't. And so, that assumption and that happens in a lot of contexts.
I think that was so fascinating, and you really like just blew my mind when you were talking about making the comparisons between non-binary and the menopause, and I that just really blew my mind and made me really think it more introspectively. So like heading a little bit back, yes, like what does it mean to be queer, and like in that like what does the LGBTQ plus stand for really? I understand that there's like some sexuality identities and some gender identities as well. Although today we'll be focusing on gender identities rather than sexuality.
Yeah. So LGBT plus typically stands for lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender. The plus in there is usually asexual, pansexual, queer, and two-spirit. And two-spirit is a word that came about in 1993 at the Manitoba powwow. And what Indigenous people struggled with was under colonization, there was sort of this forced system of two genders, and a lot of the linguistic diversity of Indigenous communities at the time was put out by that homophobia and that transphobia. And so they lost a lot of their historical terms, and so they came together and formed that term. The reason that a lot of sexual identities are grouped with gender identities, even though they're very different, um, and sometimes people, might perceive a feminine man as quote unquote gay, but we actually just know his gender expression. We don't know his sexuality. Um, with that, the reason that historically it's the same is because a lot of the LGBT rights movement in the United States is due to trans people themselves. The Stonewall riots that started with trans women of color, and then also what's typically argued in a lot of court cases is that a lot of the bias that LGBT people face, lesbian, gay, bisexual people face, is because they're coding their quote unquote queerness in a gender expression that makes them visible in some way in the workplace or at home or wherever it is that they're experiencing violence. And so it's actually a beautiful story of people coming together across difference and sort of being like, we're oppressed by the same things, and so we should be a part of the same community. So that's part of why that acronym is probably going to get longer and longer over time, because more and more people are finding that solidarity. Yeah.
Okay, so we're gonna go over to the audience a little bit for a quick Q&A section. And we are open. Let's see. Yeah, no, I thought that was, everything was so interesting. And so, oh, I think there's one question raised. Let me see. Let me see. Can somebody help me give access, give a voice to Linda? Oh, here we go. Linda, I think I allowed you to. There should be a little button that says ask to unmute. Or, yes. There we go.
Yeah, my question was about some of the terms that you're using now and how they're evolving, and whether in different places within the country, some are more favored than others.
Yeah, the short answer is absolutely. It was still sort of, it was actually quite a hard adjustment for me moving to Massachusetts because I lived in Louisiana And I didn't have the same access to some of the quote unquote woke education. And a lot of the trans people around me still used transgendered or transsexual. But when I moved to Massachusetts, that wasn't the case. The other one that I see a lot of is queer. So young people using it as like this reclamation of a slur. And then some older folks, when I've done different public health studies or just interviewed older trans folks and older LGBT folks, they prefer LGBT over queer because they do view queer still as a slur, and quite violent, and will even like tense up when that word is brought up. So age is also, so geography, yes, but also age is a huge factor that I see.
Thank you so much, Elias. I'm gonna give it up to Judy now. Judy, I have asked you for you to unmute.
Sorry, I must have accidentally clicked raise my hand or something. I don't have a question.
Oh, okay, that's okay then.
Thanks.
We do have some questions on the chat. Let's see. Oh, here we go.
There's
We have one
also
question here. Oh, I'm sorry, what?
there's also someone's hand raised as well.
Oh, I
think.
think, oh, Helen, let's go to the chat very quickly. So,
Okay.
question from Emily is, there are clear changes that need to happen at the political level to help support trans people. However, what are the things in our personal lives that cisgender people can do to support trans people? What has been particularly meaningful to you in your personal interactions with cisgender people?
Yeah, I was thinking about that. Because there's a running joke between my partner and I, because she's cis, and we joke about how awful it is that she's cis. I think the first thing that you can do interpersonally, especially if you're close to a trans person, is make space for them, and not go in assuming that you know what is best for them just because you watched this documentary or you had this resource. Another thing that I sort of do in my teaching, or that I'm learning to do in my teaching, is sort of let people know that that door is open. So there's been times in my life where I've met people who eventually came out, but had to feel comfortable doing so. And I think there's different ways that you can sort of signal yourself as an ally, in terms of you're thinking about these things, or just you're going to a talk and you're like, hey, I'm going to this talk. Do you want to go? Different things like that. I think also at the interpersonal level, what I see a lot of is even when a group of people is well intentioned, they'll do this thing where they'll put the person on the pedestal, and like, oh, this trans person is so inspiring. They do so much, but they never like ask the person to go to the movies or go shopping with them or things like that. And all of that really matters, because when I'm in a department store and I'm in the women's section, I get a lot of glares, I get a lot of stares, and it would really be helpful to have women friends who are there that are just like ready to to throw hands if need be, like just friends sometimes, because it can get lonely being on that pedestal and it can feel dehumanizing. So interpersonally, those are my two best bits of advice: is making space, and then showing up and developing those friendships in a genuine way.
Okay, thank you so much for that. So one more question before we move to our next vignette, and it comes from Michaela. And I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name. I'm a biology teacher, and I have learned in the past year that the term biological sex can be harmful. I was wondering what the best way to discuss sex chromosomes would be.
Yeah, so typically what what I encourage people to do is say specifically which part of sex they're referring to. So if you're talking about the Y chromosome, leave it there. There is, I know her first name starts with Emily, but there is a book called The Sperm and the Egg, and it's about how science classes in science literature unnecessarily genders the sperm and the egg. Like when I was in high school, the egg was, I was told it was like passive. I don't know where that narrative came from. But limiting those narratives as much as possible is typically the best policy. If you have to refer to, a category of sex, I just use assigned male at birth or assigned female at birth. And that's what a lot of community members use. And you can tell your class what you mean by that term. And they'll get it for the most part. But I try to be as specific as possible. Like, am I talking about high amounts of estrogen and estrogen in the body? Am I talking about a specific chromosome? Things like that.
Okay, that sounds good. Okay, so we have one more question, but it's more related about your research, so which we're about to get into right now. So it sounds appropriate. Okay, so I will not give it to you right now since we're about to talk about your research.
Okay.
So, okay, so I know you started as an undergraduate in neuroscience, but eventually you changed. And so what got you interested in the current research that you do right now?
Yeah, so eventually, so from my neuroscience degree, which was at a liberal arts college, and I think that was important, I was encouraged to engage in social sciences and art as well, along with my neuroscience degree. When I came to UMass Amherst, I was doing research on the mental health and cortisol levels of trans people who were engaged in activism. And one of the things that I found in my master's and published about a little bit on was this idea that there were high amounts of cortisol and dysregulated cortisol. So the way that cortisol works is it's not just high levels in utero or high levels in our life that can signal stress. It's also a dysregulation. So really low amounts of cortisol and then really high amounts. And that repeatedly over time on your body can take a toll and have a myriad of health disorders that can come later down the road, like diabetes and other things as well. And so with that, what I found was controlling for access to hormones, controlling for different life factors, trauma. Repeatedly, it was activists and people who were leading the groups, people who were going to talks and leading those that had this high amount of dysregulation and high amounts of cortisol. And so I began to be more culturally interested in that question. And since my master's was in what's known as four-field anthropology, I went more in depth with cultural questions. And so I started being interested in my PhD with these three questions of who is enabled to label themselves as a community organizer? What does authenticity mean to young trans people? And then what are the narratives that trans and non-binary people are expected to linguistically perform? I showed up and I was more and more interested in like, what are the narratives of bodies that we say about cis and trans people, and more of their experiences in medical offices, their experiences with psychologists, and what was going on there. And that was a lot of what my PhD focused on. And so for me, it was sort of following the question to what I became interested in as I grew as a scholar. Yeah.
I see. So a short definition of anthropology is like the study of humans, or
Yeah, it's the study of humans. My students get frustrated with that, but there's 4 subfields in anthropology. I think it's what makes anthropology so great is how vast it is. But there's 4 subfields. UMass Amherst kind of prides itself on being a 4 subfield degree and program. But there's cultural anthropology. That's a little bit more intuitive in that, it's about culture, food, power. There's linguistic anthropology, studying languages, how we use language to create different labels and groups. how language spreads online. There's a lot of cool stuff happening with that subfield as well. And then there's biological anthropology, which can be studying primates broadly. It can be, out in the field studying chimpanzees, or it can be studying human beings and human biology. And then there's archaeology, which is probably, if I had to guess, most people think of archaeology when they think of anthropology. I think they think of like Indiana Jones type
Yeah.
narrative when they think of archaeology, but archaeology is in anthropology as well. So
Vast as well. Yeah. Okay. So then anthropology so how would you categorize anthropology? Would it be like a social science or like natural science? And what would be even like the difference between those?
so it's both, and that's part of why I wanted to do it and wanted to pursue it in my PhD. So for the biological anthropologists and the archaeologists, you're going to see, and I lined them up on this side, they're going to be more of the natural sciences, whereas on the left side, it's going to be more of the social sciences. Part of the beliefs in anthropology is that you need both. One of my favorite books written by Daniel Wildcat, it's called Red Alert. And it's about what he calls global burning. So instead of global warming, he calls it global burning. And what he talks about is how we don't necessarily just have a biological issue with climate change. We also have a social, political issue. And so throughout my own research journey, I loved biology and the natural sciences, but I grew more and more frustrated with no one really asking the social science questions that were going to benefit my life or the people around me in a good way. And so that was part of my own journey and my own shift, and realizing that both need each other. Like we need experts in both of those, the natural sciences and the social sciences, and having these collaborative talks together, because it helps each science be better. Like each of those fields have their own biases and their own limitations, and they need each other to sort of figure out these bigger problems like climate change.
Yeah, and I definitely agree with that. The more interdisciplinary the field, probably the better. That's probably biased, but well, all generalizations are bad, but you get the gist. So how does your research look like in anthropology? Like I know it's very vast, so let's focus on the type of research that you do. So how is it? Yes.
Yeah. So what I do is look at narrative, and I do it in different methods listed on my slides in the screen here. There are many different narratives out there that you can study. So let's say, for example, we wanted to study the narratives about body weight. Okay. We could do a digital ethnography. We could observe people on Facebook and Instagram. This is something that anthropologists would do, linguistic anthropologists, and look at how are people posting about before and after photos. What are the trends that we see amongst social status or making friendships that are related to weight. Ethnography in general, it's a fancy word for saying that you're people watching. So anthropologists and cultural anthropologists, we're notorious for observing people. And that's what I do as a living. To the point where sometimes I can't turn it off. But there's different types of ethnography out there. There's also interviews. Ethnographic interviews are a little bit different than what you might see in sort of a qualitative survey in like a health study or sociology. The biggest difference there is you want the person to share as much about their life as possible. And typically that method is what's known as oral history. So it was really helpful for me to use oral history in my PhD because I had a very limited sample size. So if we think back to like what makes good data or what makes a good data set, if I'm studying something that requires not just trans people, but to be out and to be activists, I have a very limited sample size to interview people from and get their experiences. And so part of the technique of the method here is to get as much detailed stories about their life as possible, because you might only get an interview from 30 people, which is not as, it's not as big as the sample size that you would have in a massive health study or a biological based study. What anthropologists will also do is what's known as participant observation. With this, you're not just observing, but you're participating a little bit as well. So for me, this meant going out to events and actually participating in the events as an activist myself and writing about my experiences and what I sort of learned in that setting. So for me, also, one of the key components of anthropology is looking at it as a system. Illuminating who are the agents in a system. And an agent isn't like a spy going out in this context. It is, we're all agents in the system that is UMass, or maybe some of us are outside of UMass. We're individuals acting either on our own, against systems, or within systems. And so part of what I was faced with going into my PhD was, in general, there wasn't the level of discrimination of like people, for me, there wasn't this perception that transphobia wasn't real. Everybody sort of acknowledged that transphobia was real, even in the Deep South. But a lot of people didn't understand, myself included, how is transphobia spread? Like, where do we actually get transphobia come from? Like, what is its origin story? And so part of my dissertation was looking at all of the agents involved in that: healthcare providers, community organizers, police officers, neighborhood watch committees, psychologists, roommates, families of trans people. What are all of these agents doing in the system to sort of promote this particular narrative of trans people? In my research, I was really interested in narratives of safety. So what I was faced with in Atlanta in particular, but this was true of other metropolitan areas in the United States, there was this narrative that trans people were dangerous, that were someone who you should protect your kids from. We're just like waiting to recruit people to this agenda. And I was like, where is that coming from? Culturally, where is this coming from? How is this being maintained? And so for me, a lot of the things that I did was sort of show up to the local community in Atlanta, both trans people and what cis people were doing at neighborhood watch committees. And I was really focused on documenting the story of trans people themselves. Like, what were they saying in response to these narratives of safety? So I'd show up to potlucks, I'd show up to thrift store days and volunteer my time as well as a researcher. I would also sort of document my own journey through research myself as a trans researcher. So on the left, I have like all of my testosterone bottles while I was out in the fields. And in my dissertation, I talk about how hard it was. Because in Massachusetts, it was very easy for me to access my hormones, especially on campus. But when I got to Georgia, there was a lot of gatekeeping around accessing testosterone. And it was actually really hard to be an ethnographer and submerge myself into the setting of my participants while being trans. And then, I also look at a lot of the materials that people will hand out at events, not just as artifacts, but particularly as a linguistic anthropologist, and sort of noting, like, for example, on the right here, um, folks would have like very Southern pins, but at the same time signal that they're non-binary. So it was very common for people to wear this particular pin, like the possum and they.
That is
Yeah, go ahead. What were you gonna say? Go ahead.
I just love that pin. It's so cute. So,
Yeah.
so you would say that, so if you have to like answer yes or no, do you think that our cultural views of gender influence the type of questions that we do in science and like biological sciences?
Absolutely. I thought that question would come sooner. So hold on, let me find my slide on it. Yes, okay. um, Absolutely. I think that's even the case about science, like not science, for cis people. Like I'm always fascinated in the amount of how. So my first ever peer reviewed paper was an undergrad, and I looked at how many studies out there were done on male rats in neuroscience labs and not female rats. And then I looked at who the PIs were, and did a research study on that, and those correlating factors. And it absolutely does sort of matter who's in the room of like what science is produced. But what I see now in 2021 isn't necessarily like a lack of information about trans people, but there's sort of this negative bias in scientific research. And this is both the natural sciences and the social sciences. I think the social sciences are guilty of this as well. What I mean by negative bias is it's sort of like all of the research is about how terrible it is to be a trans person and how you should pity trans people and how high the suicide rate is. And on one end, that's productive because you can take that to people who want to be discriminatory and sort of say like, hey, like this is really impacting people, you should stop. And on the other end, it creates this like negative bias where we don't actually get stories of the medical successes. We don't get stories about like, what is it like as a trans woman taking estrogen? Does it actually decrease your likeliness to get heart disease later in life? Like we don't get those resistance stories in medicine and health in the same way. Um, on top of that, there's sort of a lack of data as well. A lot of the data itself is driven by nonprofit organizers or public health institutions. They're not necessarily, backed by R1 institutions. They're mostly backed by nonprofits. And so what a lot of people will face is a lot of misunderstanding, because they'll go to a well-intentioned doctor or a physician or a mental health person, and they're not properly trained. And so even if the person is well-intentioned, there can be some harm there. And then also I think we're still, all of us, cis or trans, are still sort of dealing with this colonial view of bodies and expectations. And that can be even more expansive than the things that trans people face. So for me, what I joke about is like when I go to the doctor, for example, um, uh, every health ailment I have is because I'm trans. And there are a few articles published on Medium about trans broken leg syndrome, where you can go in and say, I broke my leg. And what will happen is the doctor will be, they'll act sort of empathetic and say, oh, is this because you're trans? To give an example of my life, I went in grad school, I grounded my teeth down really hard because grad school is stressful. And I'm laughing because this dentist who, okay, so I go to the dentist and he tells me that scientifically, which when someone says that, as someone who has studied science, at least in my undergrad and master's, I'm like red flag on that end. I'm like, ooh, like established scientists don't need to say that in their language. So he says scientifically, like he thought that the testosterone that I was taking was making me grind my teeth. And I laughed so hard. And I was like, no, I think it's just because I'm a master's student. Like, please just give me a mouth guard for at night. Like,
For real. Yeah, no.
so
Okay.
that's an example of like what a lot of people will face. And it's commonly documented in a lot of public health, but it's not, necessarily in the mainstream. Like not many people know that that's what trans people go through. And I think it still shocks people. Like I'll tell, my partner, for example, that this is the case, and she's still sort of shocked every time we go to the doctor that happens to me. Like I'll be in for a cold and they'll be like, oh, is this because of the testosterone? And I'm like, no.
That's so funny.
It's not.
To have around. So I want to go into the Q&A questions a little bit. And I'm gonna address one of the questions that we have from last time. Let me just look it up. So it's a two-part question. Well, it's a three-part question almost. So first of all, we were going back earlier to how you're collecting your data, and they were interested in how are you defining older, and also whether you or there's any statistical studies on like the views of trans people or non-binary people, and like how are their view in like older populations, I guess.
Yeah, absolutely. Most of the research for that actually comes from public health studies trying to understand elderly populations over 60 in the healthcare system. So in nursing homes, and what are the things that the 60 plus crowd faces in terms of being LGBT and healthcare issues. And so if you were to go on a PubMed or anything like that, public health, older folks, LGBT, you would find it. And there's a lot done in the public health realm around the statistics of how common that is for people.
Okay, so thank you for that. So the next question we have is, due to the dynamic nature of language and the personal basis of a definition, how can one best stay informed on the modern syntax of how we talk about gender, sexuality, or identity? Secondly, is there a danger of educating a broader audience to the complex nature of trying to define an identity?
The short answer to the second one, yes. And that was part of my hesitation of, should I give like okay, I'll pause on that one. But for the first part of, can you repeat the question, the first part again?
Due to the dynamic nature of language and the personal basis of a definition, how can one best stay informed on the modern syntax of how we talk about gender, sexuality, or identity?
I think the best practice is to ask people. So even as a teacher, what I'll do at the beginning of each quarter is I'll have a form that students can fill out with their name, and then gender and pronouns. And then I ask my students, is there anything that they would like me to know about them that is important? And that way they get to decide. I think there's a harm in when people are well-intentioned and are up to date on the labels and then impose those labels on people. It's better to sort of ask people what they prefer to use and how they describe themselves and their gender, because you'll meet lots of people who use different words and don't necessarily resonate with an overarching label. And it's always like what I find is sort of keeping that open nature is the best mentality, and not necessarily, it's not about knowing the up-to-date terms. So I think sometimes people latch on that as an easy way to get into activism, and that I understand that. But I think at a human connection level, it's best to sort of ask people themselves what the terms are, and you know, not in a way of like, are you non-binary, like you're like investigating non-binary people, but like just ask them, you know, what pronouns they use, what are the terms that they want to use, especially if they're trusting you to come out or trusting you with some sort of information. At that point, it does seem warranted of just like, you can ask them, what does non-binary mean to you? That is a question that hardly any cis person has ever asked me. And if they ask me that, I'll be like, wow, that's a deep question. Let me tell you what it means to me. Yeah.
Great questions, and I'm so happy people are so curious. So one last question before we go to our third vignette and last vignette, which is the shortest one. Do you have any advice about applying for STEM jobs as a trans person who is in mid-transition, not 100% yet passing?
Okay. I so let's see.
And like maybe they can like email you or something if that is more
Yeah,
convenient.
maybe I'm trying to think, because what I had to do is not what I want other people have to do, but I don't want to like keep people from the reality that was the job market when I finished my PhD. When I did my interviews, I dressed very masculinely, in a suit. I was not out as trans to the people that I got the job with, and they love me. And I've definitely been a part of academic circles where that wasn't the case and I was out. Now as a professor, I'm out. And so now that power has shifted for me, I came out. And so my strategy was to not be out, get in the door, and then make possibility for other people. And that was my strategy. And it worked for me. But I know that there's some people who would say that that's, you know, sort of the easy way out. I don't know, but.
Yeah, definitely. Thank you so much for your candidness and honesty. So we will move on to our third and final vignette. So we were talking about the health concerns in the trans community and how do one get access to healthcare and how to actually like our views on gender influences the type of research that we do and how our research then bleeds into the medicine and how the way that we access healthcare. And so could you tell us about, I guess, more about what other like health concerns or what other obstacles are facing the trans community or the LGBT community?
Yeah. For some reason, my slides went away, so I'm trying to pull them up again. So we started looking at, let's click present. Some of these, the ones that I didn't get to, stigma. So I think historically in the United States, and this was the case when I came of age, when I was about 18 and I was wanting to start hormones, I had to go to a psychologist to get a letter that documented that I was trans. Institutionally, one of the problems was I couldn't access hormones and I couldn't have access to surgeries unless I had that letter, unless a psychologist said that, you know, I wasn't just making up that I was a boy. And for me, it meant subscribing to things about manhood that I don't agree with, for just about any man in our society. And that felt messed up, and it really limited who had access to hormones and who didn't. So it's still the case in the field when I'll go and sort of collect people's stories. They'll talk about psychologists who felt like they weren't performing womanhood enough, and so they wouldn't give the person access to estrogen. There was a story of someone in Louisiana who he was seeing a mental health professional for about 2 years and needed a letter to have what's known in community as top surgery. So removal of breast tissue in the chest. And he really needed that letter, but he showed up late to one appointment that last week, about 10 minutes late, and the psychologist said, you must not have taken this seriously, so you don't get this letter. And so there's a lot of gatekeeping around with that. Luckily in Massachusetts, most healthcare professionals run off of what's known as an informed consent model. An informed consent model means if a person is 18 years old, they get to make the decisions about their body as long as you let them know as a healthcare professional that certain things will happen. Like, for example, the form for me always says that I'll go bald. I haven't gone bald yet, but it says that I will, and that's a risk of it. That way people can look through the form themselves and decide for themselves. There's also a lot of misgendering. This can be quite hard for when people need to access immediate care or emergency care. So in emergency care rooms, there will be people who will experience a lot of violence. This is what I see like in my own research of asking people about their medical trauma. The emergency room, believe it or not, is one of the highest instances of that, because people often can't choose where they're going to go in that moment. And they actually experience a lot of discrimination in the South in terms of actually getting an ambulance to take them to the hospital. And then once they're there, having people take their pain seriously. And then on top of that, the misgendering that happens. I also think sometimes there is a misunderstanding. For me, I know based on like peer-reviewed studies of the effects of testosterone on an assigned female at birth person, you run a risk of cervical cancer. And part of that is because when you take testosterone, your menstruation ceases after a while. And I'm not going to explain this well, but basically,
It's like an overproduced production of estrogen.
Exactly. And so you have to get a pap smear just about every year, which sucks because no one likes a pap smear. As a young person, I actually struggled to get that because when I would go to doctors and say like I need a pap smear, especially since cervical cancer runs in my family, they'll be like, oh, if you're younger than 26, you don't really need this. And I'm like, I've been on testosterone for 10 years. Like I kind of need this. I don't know really what, at this point, what the impact is going to be of that. And then that also gets into the lack of data of like what a lot of, at least in my experience of, in my own research interviewing trans people, what trans people are anxious about is the lack of research about our aging bodies. So the research that exists out there is typically 20, 30-year-olds age range, and teenagers. It's not 60 years old. And that can be quite scary because they're taking hormones I'm going to take hormones most of my life. I don't really know. There's very little research about like the elderly population in terms of trans bodies and what the impact has been on people's bodies after that point. Yeah.
Well, it sounds like we have a lot of work to do, like in terms of like the health insurance and like who, like as you were saying, like who gets access to all of these medications, and also like just at every level, we just need a lot of work. So I want to end with one last question, and we have talked about diversity in science quite a bit throughout our talk, and thank you so much for all your work. What is something that we have not like discussed, or a type of like organization or question that you want to address that we should show support for, or we should definitely like be on the lookout or just learning from.
Okay.
Like,
I think,
how does diversity in your science like influences other works that you do?
can you repeat that last bit? So diversity in science and
Yeah.
then,
So how does the diversity in science like influences like the work that you do? So like just other is there any other tidbit that you would like us to know about your research, any organizations that we can like support or that will address our aim of increasing diversity in science? That's my question.
yeah. So, okay. So I think for me, one of the things that I would want to make people aware of is there's a lot of good things happening in the US South right now. There's this sort of belief that the US South is quote unquote bigoted, but there's a lot of people resisting in really cool ways. And so I would encourage people to reach out to organizations like Southern Fried Queer Pride and see the work that they're doing. At the same time, it's sort of alarming right now that science narratives, I don't think it's like scientists doing this, but science-ish narratives are being co-opted to target trans youth in school and sports. And I guess I would encourage people to sort of think about what could be the impact on trans people's lives, not just facing that discrimination, but also the fact that a lot of trans people won't be able to play sports because of this co-opted narrative of trans women just coming in spaces and ruining it for people. So I think that's one of the things that I would bring attention to, is sort of educate people when you can about sex and gender, educate people when you can about that legislation cropping up throughout the South, because it is. And with diversity in science, one of the things that I've found a lot of freedom in is looking at a lot of literature on Indigenous scientists and Indigenous knowledge, because it's there, and I think it'll sort of reshape the way we think about human science. Yeah.
Yes, I agree. I think what we know about science is so westernized that we definitely should be looking a little bit more into that indigenous knowledge. Thank you so much for that answer, Elias, Dr. Capello. So let's get into our third Q&A and last session of Q&A for today. Thank you everyone for staying with us. I know we're running a little bit over time. I'm gonna ask one of the questions by one of our attendees today, Emma Douster. She says, thank you so much for your research on female inclusion in neuroscience studies. I'm curious if you know of similar studies that are more inclusive of the non-binary community. To give you a little bit of context, she actually does research in female rats because of one of the reasons you were saying earlier, because all of these research in like male rats and none of the research in female rats. So like, if there any actually research on like more inclusivity of the non-binary community?
No, not in neuroscience. Not that I know of. Most of it's driven by social scientists, and but UMass Amherst is special in that the Feminist Studies Department, WGSS, they have a lot of feminist science being done right now. So there could be a lot of, so I took a feminist science class, and that was really cool. In that class, we didn't go over non-binary issues, but it was a lot of looking at that. And so if you're at UMass, I would highly encourage taking the feminist science course that they have. It's called like Feminist Science Methods, Research Methods. It's really great. And it was really life-changing. And it was like a lot of different people. We talked about, decentering human bodies and scientific research, and it was really cool.
It's so great that you are a UMass alumni, because I did not know about that class, and I am definitely going to look into it.
Yeah, it was really cool. And it like in that for you, like that can turn into a paper for you if that's something you're interested in your own career. So
oh my God. Well, That sounds great for Emma. And she says, thank you. One more question. What would you like science to study in the future relating to trans and non-binary people?
Yeah, I think I'm gonna go with I would like more science on elderly trans people. Yeah, like I'm about to approach 30, and as I shift in that life, I'm like, oh yeah, I would have by the time I'm 60, I would have spent most of my life as trans and most of my life taking hormones. And it does give me a sense of anxiety to not know what's going to happen to my body or like not know how to prepare for that part of my life. I think also there needs to be more public health research on the experiences of elderly LGBT people in nursing homes. People sort of forget about that population. And I think those are the two things that I would love to see.
Okay. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Capello, for your time and being here with us. It was such a wonderful hour, and I've learned a lot, definitely. And that you've made me reflect a lot, that's for sure. Much to think about. So I just wanted to like thank you again for your time and showing and sharing all this expertise and knowledge with us.
Yeah, thank y'all for having me. It's been great.
Yes, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here.